Okay, so today in the mythology lecture, we're going to focus on is a trickster hero story from the ancient Greek world. We're going to be focusing on Prometheus, and that's going to follow along the theme that we've been following, right? We've been getting into the trickster hero as a prototype for the hero. We talked about what tricksters were. We talked a little bit about creation myths, and some of that stuff is going to tie in today with what we're going to talk about in the Greek world. And we've looked specifically only at a couple stories. Last time, Osiris and Set, and the time before that, or the lecture before that, we covered the Enuma Elish, which is really a creation story, not so much a trickster story, and then tied that into the Genesis account of creation, which definitely focused on a very famous, probably the most famous trickster, the serpent from the Garden of Eden. So kind of following through, and I want you guys to try to pay attention to parallels as we talk about various myths. And I might not always bring up the parallels. I want you kind of to think on your own, because every once in a while you'll recognize something that I might just forget to mention. So there are definitely parallels that have been drawn between our trickster hero today, Prometheus, and Satan. And then next time we're going to be doing the myth of Loki, death of Balder. So I want you also to think about parallels between the character today, Prometheus, with Loki, which I'll again highlight when we get there. But the parallels between Satan and Prometheus have been brought out by many people over the centuries, and there are also some huge differences between the two. Okay, so hopefully you'll be able to figure out what those are as we go. So right now I'm going to actually turn our attention to the story of Prometheus. So let's take a look at some background material. I'm going to start, since we actually haven't done Greek myth. I know we've talked about Oedipus when we did our introduction, but we haven't actually delved into the Greek world. And we're going to be spending a lot of time in the Greek world over the course of the semester. So let's give a little bit of a background for the Greeks. I'm going to do this every once in a while. I might not be consistent with my introductions, but the map there is basically the Greek world, or the world of the Bronze Age Aegean. If you want to go back far enough into, I guess, what we would call European history, you have the very earliest civilization spring up on the island of Crete. If you're not familiar with the geography of the region, I know you can't see the cursor on the screen. The island at the very bottom of this region, you can see the Aegean Sea, which was basically between Europe and Asia, technically the Greek mainland, and Asia Minor, or Anatolia, which is now modern-day Turkey. You've got all those islands littering the sea. And then at the bottom, you've got this really big one called Crete. There's one particular site on the northern coast of Crete known as Knossos, which is labeled there, so you know exactly what you're looking at. But this was the birthplace of the first civilization in Europe. It was called the Minoan civilization. Prospered really between 2600 and about 1500 BC, give or take. And they were a fairly advanced civilization. They had a written system. Their writing was something that we referred to as Linear A. We can't read it because we don't know the Minoan language, but they were a pre-Greek people. Okay, I know this is going to be the world of the Greeks, but even though they themselves were not Greek, didn't speak Greek, they're going to have a big impact on the later Greeks, particularly in the areas of religion and myth and stuff like that. You'll see a lot of references to Knossos and their famous King Minos in Greek mythology. As a matter of fact, that's where the word that we name the civilization from is from the king, King Minos. So it's called Minoan civilization. That's not what they called themselves, but it's what we call themselves. It's what we call them. So, all right, now that's the first civilization. And they're going to have a direct impact on the first Greeks who come into the Greek world in a second. But before we get to them, I'm going to talk about what is really kind of the pre-Greek period. So prior to the arrival of the Greeks, and the Greeks start coming into the Greek mainland around 2000 BC, you have earlier indigenous peoples that some people refer to as the Pelasgian peoples. There's a lot of speculation as to who these people are, how that word is actually used, because the word Pelasgian is used in different ways by different ancient authors, and there's all kinds of different theories as to exact meaning of the word, the origins of the word, what it pointed to. I mean, it has been interpreted as meaning peoples of the sea. It has been interpreted as meaning peoples from nearby lands. and so on. So it's really not clear what that means. And when the Greek writers used it, sometimes it's actually used of what we think of as kind of the pre-Greek inhabitants. Sometimes it's actually used of Greeks. Sometimes it's used of Cretans. So one of the theories, and I'm just going to throw this one out there, is that these were the people that were there prior to the arrival of the Greeks. And one of the theories in modern mythology, and it's not necessarily one of the dominant theories, was the idea of kind of an earlier matriarchal religion prior to the arrival of the Indo-European tribes like the Greeks themselves, who brought in the worship of a sky father figure. And the idea, and this is really kind of promoted by people like Robert Graves, who wrote a really pretty substantial volume on Greek mythology, but he was not a classicist or an archaeologist or anthropologist, but really just a literary critic. And he had a particular theory as to this earlier matriarchal stage in the Greek world that he identifies with these Pelasgian peoples and the worship of their mother goddess. So I'm going to give you kind of a creation myth in a second that he kind of reconstructs for us. But the Greeks come in definitely around 2000 or so, and they bring with them very clearly the Indo-European pantheon of sky father figures. And there is this theory that the Greeks end up either displacing or merging with the earlier peoples, and you start to have the religions intertwine, where you've got the sky god figures like Zeus kind of coupled with and married off to some of the earth mother goddesses that probably were there prior to the arrival of the Greeks. So, and some people say that's the reason you have all these wonderful stories of Zeus having these love affairs with all these different goddesses. Kind of reflects this early mingling, I guess you could say. Now, of course, Zeus ends up marrying one particular goddess. It's the goddess Hera, and that's his sister. And possibly because, well, I guess the theory, if I was just going to elaborate on it, I don't really want to spend much time with this, but theory is that in various places there would be different mother goddess figures, whether she went by the name Rhea or Hera or Demeter or Persephone. I mean, you could just go on and on listing mother goddess figures. And Zeus would have affairs with different ones in different localities, wherever that particular goddess was the favored name. And over time, being that the Greeks themselves were in favor of kind of monogamy, the idea of one husband, one wife, that at some point the Greek pantheon would have had Zeus marrying a particular goddess, and that would have reflected maybe the dominant tradition at a particularly powerful center. So very early in early Greek history, you've got the center at Argos being a fairly powerful and important site, and Argos happened to be pretty much tied to the goddess Hera. There was a tradition of worshiping Hera as almost a patron goddess of that region and that city, and maybe due to that early phase of development, that became, when Greek myth was kind of being codified in some sense, she becomes the dominant figure that is his official wife, whereas other couplings, Zeus and this goddess or that goddess would have been considered then love affairs, kind of extramarital affairs. And of course, Zeus has this reputation of having lots of extramarital affairs, which we're going to have to talk about, especially when we get to some of the hero stories, like the story of Heracles. Okay, long story short, you've got this Greek tradition that's going to evolve. And in the Bronze Age, the high point of the Bronze Age Greek settlers is the era of the Mycenaeans. We call this the Mycenaean culture, which was strongest between about 1600 and 1100 BC, give or take. It's also considered the Age of the Heroes. So all the great stories we're going to read later from Jason and Heracles and the Iliad, all those stories would have taken place, according to the later Greeks, as happening during this age. Okay, that's why we call it the Age of the Heroes, the Bronze Age. Actually, the late Bronze Age, particularly Troy, for instance, would have fallen somewhere around 1200 BC. But this is an older group of Greeks that we refer to as Mycenaeans because the dominant city at the time seems to be the center at Mycenae. And you could see that in the map, or on the map, in a place very close to Tiryns. This is the southern portion of Greece known as the Peloponnesus. Almost all those centers on the mainland would have been Bronze Age Mycenaean centers. Iolkos, we're going to come back to that later. That would be the city where Jason is associated. Mycenae for Heracles, Tiryns for Heracles, Mycenae also for Agamemnon, some of the great heroes of the Trojan War. Athens was a Mycenaean center, though not very significant, actually fairly minor. And Thebes we've already been to before with the story of Oedipus. So all of that material would have dealt with this era. The Mycenaean era eventually collapses by, say, 1150 or so, and you go into a period of decline and what we call the Dark Ages. From about 1100 to 800, we don't have very much information. They're not writing. They actually had written documents during the Mycenaean era, but the use of any kind of written system was lost. So we don't have very much by way of archaeology either during the Dark Ages, which is why we call it the Dark Ages. We can't see into that period too clearly. But around 800, you start to have, through contact with the Levant, particularly the Phoenician territories of Levant, the introduction of an alphabet, and we break into the historical period and what we call the archaic period of ancient Greece, from about 800 to 480. This is early Greece. This is old Greece. That's what the word archaic means, old. And this is the time, thanks to the advent of writing, or the introduction of an alphabet, really, to the Greek world, where we have our earliest poetry preserved, Homer. Okay, around 750, we've got the greatest of the Greek poets. He is the one all other Greek poets, especially I'm talking epic poets, look back to as the model to follow. And he left us, as if we know who this is, there's question as to, all kinds of stuff about Homer. We don't really know very much about him. He's kind of a semi-legendary figure. But the name is attached to two epics, the Iliad, which seems to be a little earlier, and then the Odyssey, which follows. It's possible that they're written by different individuals or different schools, but the name has been attached, and I'm just going to go and refer to both of those as works of Homer. We'll deal with the Iliad later this semester. The Odyssey, I don't think I'm going to talk about, but maybe by way of reference here and there. The other individual that I've got on the screen is Hesiod. And Hesiod would have been a little bit after the time of Homer, possibly late contemporary, but Hesiod is going to be one of these figures who kind of preserves early Greek mythology in a way that attempts a codification. He attempts to take a whole bunch of different stories and to put it into a couple different accounts and preserve it for us. So from him, we're going to get the creation accounts, the birth of the gods, the fight between the gods and the titans, the stories that we're going to deal with today primarily, which is why I'm introducing Hesiod, because he's going to give us the accounts, or the earliest at least accounts, of Prometheus and Pandora. Okay, so we'll talk about Hesiod, and that's who you were supposed to read for today. And I know it was difficult reading, like I mentioned earlier, but again, archaic period. After the Persian Wars, we are into the classical period. The Second Persian War wraps up around 479, but the classical period we're going to date from 480 to 323. I'm just going to go a little bit further, because throughout the entire period of Greek civilization, you have lots and lots of literature produced that deals with mythology, that elaborates on mythology, and that analyzes mythology. During the classical period, this is classical because it's like the high point of the Greek ancient world. It's when Athens was at its peak. It's when you've got the great tragedies and comedies written in 5th century Athens. And a lot of that material we're going to talk about as the course goes along, because some of that material is going to elaborate on some of these earlier myths. But the body of literature continues to develop. This goes all the way through the time of Alexander the Great. He dies in 323, which kind of concludes the classical period. Then you have the Hellenistic period. And this is where you have really a mixture of Greek and other cultures of the ancient East. Thanks to the conquest of Alexander, you've got kind of Egyptian and Near Eastern ideas beginning to mix with the Greek world. You've got these large, I guess you could say, cosmopolitan centers like Alexandria and Pergamon and stuff like that evolve, where you have the big kingdoms, you've got centers of learning develop and great libraries constructed, and all this kind of stuff is eventually going to spill over into the greater Mediterranean world, particularly in the world of the Romans. So about 146, the Romans conclude their conquest of Greece, and you have this Greco-Roman culture, I guess, begin to develop. And I really hate to talk about it as if it's a unified culture. The Romans were a distinct culture from the Greeks. They're going to be heavily influenced by the Greeks, and we're going to deal with some Roman mythology later, but Roman mythology is really not the same as Greek mythology. Romans embrace Greek mythology, but as we get to Romans later on, you're going to see that the Romans had their own stories that were primarily political myths. they didn't really write that much about the gods. The god stories they adopted from the Greeks. Now, it was during the Roman Empire period Christianity starts to spread, and by the 4th century, Christianity really is spreading to the point where it becomes, by the end of the century at least, the official religion of Rome. It was legalized around 313. It's when the Edict of Milan was issued, and that kind of stops the persecution of Christianity. Probably shouldn't have used the word legalized, only because the Romans were very open to many religions, and it was only periodically that they persecuted Christians. But in this switch to Christianity, you're going to start to see Greek paganism begin to disappear. You're going to have a lot of the mythic material, sometimes demonized by the Christian church. But interestingly, at another level, these stories are often embraced by the Christians, and into the Middle Ages, it becomes kind of like common tales people would be expected to know, especially when we get to the Renaissance. You have a whole revival in the love of Greco-Roman story and such. So, big heritage. That's a very quick overview and probably not the best and most concise overview I could have given you, but I didn't want to spend all day there because we've got a story to deal with. So, anybody have any questions on that background? If you do, you could text it, and I will move on to our theme of chaos again. Okay? You might be tired of the theme of chaos, but we need to talk about it a little bit more because the Trickster hero, remember, is a hero that is going to introduce a series, or at least a challenge to the cosmic order, particularly in standing up against the father archetype, standing up against the main god. We saw that with Satan challenging the domination of Yahweh in Genesis. We saw that with Set overthrowing Osiris. And we're going to see it today with Prometheus standing up against Zeus. Okay, but before we get to that story, I want to talk a little bit about some of the creation stories. And I'm going to start with really what's sometimes referred to today as the Pelagian creation story. Now, this is not a traditional Greek myth, but kind of a reconstructed scenario. But I'm going to give it to you anyways. And it's based on different little fragments of things here and there. The visuals that you see on the screen, you've got at the left-hand side of the screen, the snake goddess. This is a figurine that was found at Knossos. This is from Minoan, Crete, and it was a partially reconstructed statue. I know there's pieces of it that have been attached that probably aren't part of the original, like the little cat that's on the head of the goddess. But in her hands, she's holding these snakes, and the snake goddess figurine, this is just one of a number of different figurines of that motif. Very much a fertility figure. And if you remember when we discussed the Enuma Elish, we saw the mother goddess Tiamat, who is often described as a dragon or a serpent, who was killed by Marduk, right? And she represented chaos, and he is the one who imposes order on the universe. So you got this idea of the serpent associated with a goddess, associated with creation. And here you have another example of that type of thing, a mother goddess associated with a serpent. So the serpent's got these fertility aspects. It's not just an emblem of chaos, death, destruction, but it's also a symbol of life. It's associated with the earth. It's associated with the shedding of its skin, as we'll see when we get to the legend of Gilgamesh later. So it's a symbol of rebirth. And the serpent, if you think about it, and its connection to the earth itself, is going to have this tie both to life and death. You know, you find them in places like the fields and under the rocks. So it's kind of connected to the upper world and the lower world. There's a whole connection between the lower world and the upper world as far as the metaphor of planting the seed into the earth, almost like the idea of burying what is dead and something new and alive springing forth. So the earth itself is both the place where you bury the dead, but also a place that produces a new life. So this whole cycle of death and rebirth is very much tied into ancient people's understanding of agricultural cycles and stuff like that. Now, we're not focusing a lot on creation stories this semester or fertility stories, but every once in a while I might bring out a little bit of that. And this supposed Pelagian creation story, that visual isn't supposed to come up just yet, but this Pelagian creation story has some of those elements in it as well. The way it's been reconstructed is you've got this chaotic state in the beginning where you have water. Not a surprise. Almost all the stories, it's water or chaos in the beginning. Sometimes waters of chaos. And On the water, you have this goddess Eurynome who is dancing, and she eventually conjures forth Ophion, who is the serpent. And the two of them, the goddess and the serpent, kind of mingle together and copulate and produce an egg. Okay, so it's like a mating. And again, the serpent, even though Tiamat herself is usually characterized as a serpent, sometimes is distinguished as a male figure. And it's the male and female duality that kind of comes together to produce life, which is a natural assumption, right? This is kind of the way things work biologically. But the serpent sleeps with Eurynome, and this egg comes forth, and then the serpent coils himself around the egg, breaks it open, and out springs everything from the heavens and the earth and the beginning of life and the seeds of life. Okay? Of course, in the end of the story, she destroys the serpent, and then you've got an explanation of where the original people emerged from. Okay? So that's kind of, in a nutshell, this story where you've got cosmos coming out of chaos. Now the Greeks, and this is where you get to Hesiod's theogony. I didn't really mention what he wrote, but he wrote a theogony, which means the birth of the gods, and one other work called Works and Days. Both of those poems overlap in various areas. So with Hesiod's theogony, he's going to give us another picture of the creation where we're going to go back to this primordial state of chaos. This idea of, again, undifferentiation, this idea of no order, formlessness, void, actually is what the original word chaos means. But out of this chaos, you have a few things emerge. You've got Gaia, Tartarus, and Eros. Now, Gaia is the one we want to pay attention to. I'm not going to talk about the others, but Gaia is going to be basically the Earth, Mother Earth, as she comes to be known. So again, you've got this idea of femininity associated with the Earth itself. And again, the mother goddess being kind of the goddess who's associated with giving birth, creating life, is going to need something to help that process along. And she creates for herself a son or a child known as Uranos, the god of heaven. Okay, and then she mates with her son. So again, you got this idea of incestuous relationships, very big in Greek mythology. And they produce a number of children as well. Among these children are going to be the Titans. Now, the Titans are going to be led ultimately by Kronos. Now, Kronos in the story is going to overthrow his father, Uranos, by castrating him. It's a motif we saw in the Osiris story. Osiris, remember, lost his genitals, represented his death. Kronos does the same thing. He lies in wait for his father, Uranos, slices off his genitals with a sickle, and then throws them into the ocean, and a number of things spring forth, including the goddess Aphrodite, according to his story. And then Kronos becomes a new ruler. So you've got this generational war between the old and the new, and it's going to continue on with the story of the birth of Kronos' children, which is going to include Zeus. Now, I would love to be able to elaborate the story because there's so much interesting stuff going on. The picture that showed up in the middle of the screen is a picture of Rhea presenting Zeus with a wrapped up rock. If you know the story, Kronos was afraid of being overthrown by his children the same way he overthrew his father. So whenever his children are born, he goes into this mad state of insanity, literally, and swallows his children in kind of a panic. Rhea doesn't think to hide the children until the sixth and final child is born, and this is the baby Zeus. He's the youngest of his siblings. Instead, she hides the baby away and gives the father a rock wrapped up like a baby. And you might think, well, how can he fall for a rock? I mean, how stupid can the guy be to think this is a baby and he swallows the rock instead? But again, the idea of insanity is usually in Greek religion in mythology viewed as this state of possession where you literally can't see reality. Okay, so, if he's in that kind of state of possession or fury or frenzy, he literally wouldn't know what he's looking at. Okay, so he could very easily fall for a deception as poor as a rock dressed as a baby. Anyways, he swallows the child, the rock. Zeus is raised in secret on the island of Crete, and then eventually is reintroduced into the story where he poisons his father. His father vomits up the gods, kind of a birth motif right there, where he's vomiting out the children, kind of like a mother goddess giving birth. And then these 6 children, which would include Poseidon, Hades, Hera, Hestia, and Demeter, join with Zeus in a war against the Titans. Okay, now that's going to bring us to Prometheus, because Prometheus is a Titan. He is one of the younger generation of Titans, but Prometheus is smart enough in the stories to side with Zeus. Because when the Titans eventually fall and they're imprisoned in the pit of Hades known as Tartarus, Prometheus is not. Okay? So let's kind of turn our attention to Prometheus. And Pandora, by the way, we'll get to a little bit later. So her name's up there a little bit prematurely. All right, Prometheus is our trickster hero. In some accounts, he is the creator of mankind. Ovid, the Roman poet, gives us the story where he creates man the way a potter would throw a pot on a potter's wheel. He creates man out of clay, very similar to the Egyptian story of Khnum, fashioning man from clay. So he's going to be a creator figure, which means, again, someone who brings order out of chaos, but at the same time, he's a trickster figure who's going to re-inject chaos as he challenges the order that Zeus has on the world. The cultural hero aspect is, first of all, as a creator of man, he is going to be responsible for mankind in a certain sense, and he's going to be the type of figure who's going to try to benefit his creation by being a proponent of mankind against the gods. He's going to be a savior figure. He's going to be a man who, or a god, who tries to bring benefits to humankind. And the famous story that I want to focus on right now is this issue at Mekone. Mekone was a place where there's a debate going on between people about how to sacrifice to Zeus. All right? You've got Zeus up in Olympus. He's the god that you need to appease. He's the one that you need to offer sacrifice to. But the question is, what exactly do you sacrifice? Or what part of the animal, once it's sacrificed, are you going to actually burn in offer to Zeus? Because the idea is, once you kill the animal, the part that you offer to the god is usually burned on an altar. Okay, and the fire will bring the aroma of the sacrifice up to the heavens, right? It goes up to the sky where the gods can enjoy it. And the whole idea of a sacrifice, by the way, is to keep the gods happy, to get them to bless you, to get them to at least not smite you. So it's really important to give the gods something that they're going to like, because if you don't give them things that they're going to like, it's kind of dangerous. But at the same time, there's the problem of scarcity of food, perhaps, or at least if you know anything about the ancient Greek diet, I mean, it was primarily grain. They did have fish because it's obviously a very important, sea. It's where it's located. It's all surrounded by sea, so there's a lot of, not only sea trade, but also fish was a staple of the diet. But when it comes to, like, say, offering an ox or a bull, those types of animals you want to eat very often. You also have to realize in the ancient world you don't have places to refrigerate meat, and you have to treat it a certain way if you want to preserve it for any length of time. But generally, meat was not an everyday occurrence. Meat would be something that would be kind of a treat, maybe during festivals, and it was usually tied to sacrifice. You sacrifice to the gods, and then the meat would usually be eaten and spread around in some kind of celebration. So the question here is, do we keep the meat for ourselves because it seems kind of wasteful to burn all the meat up to Zeus, but at the same time, if you keep the meat for yourselves, you're going to get Zeus angry at you, and that might backfire, right? The whole purpose is to make Zeus happy. So they don't know what to do. They don't know what to offer. They don't know what to burn. And along comes Prometheus. Now, I didn't really introduce his name, but Prometheus' name is often interpreted to mean forethought. Okay? Forethought is to indicate that he is a type of crafty individual who thinks before he acts. He can even see the future. He's a wise figure. Maybe I should be careful of using the word wise. He's at least a crafty figure, because remember, those are not the same thing. And by the way, he has a twin brother who's going to come into the story in a little bit. His name is Epimetheus. Now, Epimetheus is the opposite. His name is afterthought. All right, he's the one who actually acts and then thinks about it a little bit too late, like most of us. But Prometheus comes along and he says, okay, I've got a solution to your problem. I'm going to take this animal, and here's what we're going to do. We're going to sacrifice the ox, and we're going to take the hide of the animal, and we're going to sew it into 2 bags. Bag number 1, we're going to put all of the bones. But on top of the bones, we're going to cover it with the fat of the animal. In bag number 2, we're going to put all the meat inside there. And then on top of that, we're going to put the stomach and the innards and things that don't look too appetizing and set that on top. And we're going to set the 2 bags out, and we're going to say, Zeus, you pick. Okay, now Hesiod says that Zeus sees that the trick is being perpetrated and decides to at least play along with it and fall for the trick the way he was, Prometheus wanted him to. So again, here's the challenge to the god. Here's Prometheus trying to put one over on the ruler of the universe for the most part. And of course, which bag is supposed to be the good bag? The one with the meat in it, right? The other half bag number one, it's got bones, not too appetizing. Not that you can't get nutrients out of it, but for the story's sake, that's the least valuable of the two bags. And you might look at the top and say, okay, what's the difference? The fat doesn't look all that appetizing. I guess that's because we today tend to think of the fat as stuff that you usually remove from the meat when you cook it. But if you think about it, the fat is the part that smells the best, right? When you grill out, if you are a person that eats meat, the fat has the aroma that makes it seem so delicious. It's actually the tastiest part. So the idea of the fat being on top is the idea that from the outside, it looks really good. It looks like the best. But when you get down below that surface layer, there's nothing but bones. The other bag, on the surface, it doesn't look so good, but when you get below the layer, it has all the stuff that really is good, the meat. Okay, so you could get all kinds of lessons out of this. I mean, one very simple one is, things are not always as they seem, right? You can't judge a book by its cover. You can put that in a number of different cliche phrases, but that's one of the lessons kind of built in here. But again, Zeus picks the one that has the bones, and then he punishes man for the deception. By the way, here's Zeus, very famous bronze statue of Zeus. Here's Zeus with his eagle up above, and now Zeus is a god of lightning, thunder. And the punishment for man, due to Prometheus' trick of trying to fool Zeus, was for Zeus to remove fire. Now, the thunderbolt of Zeus, which you could barely see in the top photograph, it's in his backhand. He's got that, what's supposed to be an eagle on his front hand. His backhand holds this thunderbolt. And the thunderbolt is representation of fire from the heavens, right? I mean, that's what lightning is. It's the power of the gods. So the idea of removing fire from mankind is this idea of removing a sense of power from mankind. And it's an appropriate punishment, because if you think about it's kind of a catch-22 if you think about it. Man gets to keep the meat, but if Zeus takes the fire away, how's he going to cook it? He can't. So go ahead and let them eat the raw meat. The problem, the reason why I call it a catch-22, is because what does Zeus want from mankind? Anybody know? I know I don't stop enough to ask questions, but text it if you have an idea. The whole debate, exactly. He wants sacrifice. Now, here's the problem. If man doesn't have the fire, man can't offer the sacrifice. So man loses out on something, but Zeus also loses out on something, which might be why Zeus kind of doesn't guard the fire the way he should. Because the next part of the story, and let's unpack this idea of fire just a little bit further too. Fire is a symbol. Usually represents life, represents power. You could think of it as representing control. And if you think about it, it makes sense. It's the basis of technology. Whether you're trying to make pottery, right? You need good fire to be able to, fire the pots in a kiln and make them really useful. I mean, you could use sun-baked clay, but it's not really as good. To work with metal, even copper and bronze, you need fire, iron, all that kind of stuff. So it's a basis of technology, which is this idea of man taking control over nature, right? This goes back to that whole theme of ordering chaos. Man wants control. You think about early man trying to find places to live. You can think of, this idea of dwelling in a cave. Lots of things to worry about when you try to find shelter in a cave. Hunter-gatherer wandering societies, you seek shelter in a cave. You've got things like darkness. You've got cold. It's wet. There may be bigger, more ferocious animals already living in there. Now you're at a huge disadvantage unless you have fire. I mean, that one tool is going to allow you to take control of your world, right? You can go into the cave. You have light in the darkness. It brings warmth to the cold. It dries out the dampness, and it will drive out more dangerous animals, because humans are really the only animals that effectively work with fire. Most other animals are afraid of it. So where man is kind of a vulnerable, physically vulnerable animal compared to most of the rest of the animal kingdom, fire balances things out. Technology balances things out. And here Zeus removes it. So what does Prometheus do next? He's going to try to help mankind out a second time. And he's going to go steal the fire. Right, he sneaks into Olympus and supposedly takes the fire or an ember from the fire into a fennel stalk and brings it back and gives it to mankind so that mankind now has control, right, and now can sacrifice and all those things as was appropriate. And again, I think maybe Zeus allowed that to happen, but he's not going to allow them to get away with it. There will be another punishment on top of that one. Okay, oh, there's the meat again. I've got to fix the PowerPoint. One thing that I almost forgot to mention, actually, matter of fact, it just jumped into my mind and then just jumped right back out again. Trying to remember what it was. Let me think about it here. Okay, here it is. The whole story about the bags of meat. We talked about function, myth function, and we talked about charter theory. So here is an explanation of this particular myth that I think might be useful to understand how myth functions. The charter theory, if you remember back to our introductory lecture, has to do with explaining institutions and also validating institutions or customs. Now, when it comes to sacrifice, the actual way sacrifice was done in the Greek world was, if you have a big sacrifice like a bull or an ox or something valuable like that, the tradition among the Greeks was you sacrifice the animal, you offer a portion of it to the gods, and then you keep the meat, and like I said earlier, you feast on it. Now, the reason this story can be considered kind of a charter myth is, or even from a sociological point of view, it's explaining why man does it that way, why the Greeks sacrifice in that manner, but it also is tantamount to permission to sacrifice that way. Because remember, the problem would be if you offend the gods in a sacrifice, you're risking a lot, right? The gods can smite you. Zeus, who does have the thunderbolt, can strike you down from where he is up in the mountain. So the story is basically saying Zeus picked what he wants. Go ahead and offer him the parts that you don't want to eat. It's not wrong to do that. Zeus made the rule basically in his choice, so man can get away with keeping the good parts to himself. You don't have to worry about Zeus getting angry. So that's kind of how it functions in a sociological context. All right, so I think that's kind of a neat part of the story. But let me go on, and if you got questions, go ahead and text them. But I'm going to go on and kind of show you where the story goes from there, because now that we've got the theft of fire, we're going to need another punishment come in to the tale. And the punishment, the theft of fire. There's an illustration of Prometheus stealing the fire. I got a little bit behind on the slides, but let's go to now Pandora. Now this is going to be a part that can offend many. This is, again, Hesiod writing, not me. But the punishment for the theft of fire, the punishment for mankind, was the creation of woman. Now, the Theogony by Hesiod doesn't actually name the woman. In the Works and Days, and I gave you excerpts from both of those poems to read, Works and Days does name her. Now, the name Pandora, anybody know what the name means? Pan in Greek means all, and Dora has to do with gifts. So her name basically means all gifted. And it's because the gods created her, Zeus created her, with all kinds of charms and skills, kind of equipped by different gods. Athena bestows upon her various skills. Athena was a goddess of craft and skill. Aphrodite bestows on her the most beauty and attractiveness that is going to then lure man in, etc., etc. Now, the punishment seems really strange, but in a way, I think Hesiod is using the story to be a balance to the removal of, or the theft of fire. Because remember, fire represents control. And in a certain sense, woman, for Hesiod, I think, represents a loss of control. Right? This element that is unpredictable in the lives of men. And again, I'm trying to summarize Hesiod, not my own particular view, so don't send me nasty emails. The idea, I guess you could think of it maybe in the context of a patriarchal society like ancient Greece, where it's very important to have a tight rein on the family structure. I don't know if I've talked about this in past. I usually do when I cover the myth of Persephone and Demeter, but it was a society that had arranged marriages. It was usually the father that arranged the marriage. The daughter, the women in the household in general, really didn't have much life outside of the household. The men that they came into contact were usually the extended family, maybe servants if you're a little bit wealthier. But the idea of keeping women kind of secluded and outside of public life was probably in part due to the idea of keeping lineage pure, maybe being afraid that you don't know who your children would be, because again, one of the big questions for every father would be, is the child that was just born really my child, or is it somebody else's potentially? I mean, there's never a question who the child's mother is, but there's always the potential question who the child's father is. So maybe to keep control of the scenario a little bit so that you actually pass on your name to the appropriate person. Maybe that's one of the reasons these societies might, seclude the women. In ancient Greece, it differs from city to city. I'm kind of giving you the generic way that might be common to place like ancient Athens. Ancient Sparta had a much more free society for women. But anyways, it's just one theory, so I'm just going to throw that out there. So again, control versus loss of control. You can think of it that way. Anyways, she is given not to Prometheus. He's not foolish enough to marry this woman or take this woman in. But his brother, Epimetheus, is. Even though Prometheus has warned him never to take a gift from Zeus, Epimetheus falls for it, because she's attractive. And again, he's not thinking, because he always thinks a little bit too late. Now, here's the problem with Pandora. She might be incredibly beautiful and skillful, but she has a curiosity that is going to get her into trouble when it comes to this jar that she has. Now, you may have heard of this as Pandora's box. It was actually a jar in the mythology, and inside the jar, who knows what was placed there? Anybody have an idea? What's in the famous jar of Pandora? Okay, chaos is a very good guess. In a way, it is kind of connected to chaos. It's a little bit more specific. There are certain things in there. All right, disease and everything bad. Very, very good. And of course, her curiosity causes her to lift the lid of the jar, and all of the evils spill out into the world, because inside the jar was placed every evil that exists. Now, before everything could escape, there was one thing left when she put the lid back on quickly, and it was hope. So now, let me see if you could figure out what is going on here. There are different interpretations that I've heard over the years from various professors and such as to what this means. Anybody have an idea? Anybody ever think about the moral of the story, if there is a moral to this story? What on earth is going on with hope? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. Okay, that is actually one of the theories that I've heard, or in the interpretations, that in the end, there's always hope. Very good. Or at least we have hope. How many have heard something like that before? There's a problem with that, though, and it would be this. We don't have hope. What actually do we have? Not what's in the jar, right? It's everything that got out of the jar. Yeah, we have everything but hope. Maybe that's the problem, is that, we have no hope. But I think we can even push it a little bit further and question why it's in there in the first place. Because remember, the gods put all the evils in the world inside the jar. So just the very fact that hope is in the jar should make you question whether or not hope is a good thing, right? Okay, the idea of false hope, that does sound bad. But I'm going to take the most pessimistic view of Hesiod and actually say, well, maybe all hope can be considered false hope. Yeah, I don't know if the idea that hope will prevail is really much on Hesiod's mind. Let me maybe interpret it this way. It's in the jar. So I think Hesiod is clearly saying hope is a bad thing. Actually, let me come back to that in a second. This will make more sense as I get to the next few slides, but I think it's being placed in the jar means hope is evil. The fact that it's in the jar still, that actually might be a good thing. But why does he consider it evil? Actually, let me hold off slightly on that because I want to talk about his myth of the ages, and then I'm going to come back to this idea of hope as an evil, why he might consider it an evil. So Hesiod's a very pessimistic writer in a certain sense. If you want to interpret him that way, I tend to interpret him that way. So his pessimistic worldview actually comes out just in his description of women, right? I already said he kind of blames women for everything. They're kind of this evil that has been given to mankind. I'm going to read this section from the Theogony right here. So talking about women, for from her, Pandora, is the race of women and female kind, and of her is the deadly race and tribe of women who live amongst mortal men to their greatest trouble. To their great trouble. I got to read it more accurately, sorry. No helpmeets in hateful poverty, but only in wealth. And, even so, Zeus, who thunders on high, made women to be an evil to mortal men. He's very clear what he's saying here. With a nature to do evil. And he gave them a second evil to be the price for the good they had. Whoever avoids marriage and the sorrows that women cause will not wed, reaches deadly old age without anyone to tend his years. And though he at least has no lack of livelihood while he lives, yet when he is dead, his kinfolk divide his possessions among them. And as for the man who chooses the lot of marriage and takes a good wife, suited to his mind, evil continually contends with good. For whoever happens to have mischievous children lives always with unceasing grief in his spirit and heart within him, and this evil cannot be healed. I know I didn't read that as smoothly as I wanted to, but very clearly, he thinks this whole situation is about as bad as it can be. Whether you marry or not, women is an evil, but living without them is bad in its own right. This idea of suffering is going to come out even more clearly in his poem of the Myth of the Ages, which is actually in both works as well. As a matter of fact, I think I included a version of the Myth of the Ages in the excerpts that you were supposed to read. So let me go through this really quickly. This is another creation story of sorts, which breaks down the world down into ages where things change. So for instance, in the beginning, you have what's called the Golden Age, which is like paradise on earth. There's no suffering. Human beings eventually die. They don't explain why they die. It's just that they're not gods, right? That's one thing that distinguishes the gods from man. Man are the dying ones, and the gods are the deathless ones, okay? The athanatos, the undying. Human beings die, but in this early age, they go and become blessed spirits, right? They've got this positive afterlife. The cool thing about this idea of paradise is there's no change in the weather. Everything is blooming. Everything is growing. You don't have to work. You don't have to suffer. You don't need shelter. It's perfect. But the age ends, and you have the Silver Age come into play. Now, the Silver Age is going to be a big change. It's a fall from paradise. There's going to be a change of seasons. The weather will change. You're going to have to now labor. You're going to have to suffer. You're going to have to work to produce food. And when you die, you'll go to Hades. Right? This is the generic underworld. But it doesn't stop there. It continues to get worse. The next stage is the Bronze Age, and the Bronze Age is an age of violence and death. Man is violent. They are always at war just for the love of violence itself, for no real reason. And when they die, they go to the very pit of Hades, which is known as Tartarus. This is where the Titans were placed as a torture, as a torment. This is a place of punishment. Hades itself, by the way, is not necessarily bad. It's kind of neutral, but there are places of torment like Tartarus. Again, depending on the mythology that you embrace. After that, you have this really interesting period that kind of breaks the mold, which is the Age of the Heroes. Now, why he puts in this little glimmer of hope is hard to say. Probably, I think, because the heroes, are part of the Greek history, right? This idea of people like Heracles and Odysseus and Achilles, they would have lived really at the end of the literal Bronze Age, historically speaking, but they were more noble, right? They fought, there was death, there was war, but at the same time, there were reasons to fight, virtues that were upheld. And these guys who are more noble, when they died in battle, they would go off to Elysium, which is this idea of a paradise. Okay. However, things didn't stay there. They didn't remain. In Hesiod's own day, he put us in the Iron Age. And this is an era of suffering where man is about as bad as it can be. And he says on the horizon is this impending destruction that we, if we don't change, have yet to face, right? This ultimate fate. So this is kind of his view of the world, the history of the world, mythologically, is this downward slide into worse and worse conditions. Okay, it's also interesting how he uses the metals, right? In a way, in each age, man has fewer and fewer values and becomes more and more base, right? You move from gold to iron, you're moving in a place from great value to less value. And at the same time, you're moving in a direction where the metals actually become harder, right? Iron is obviously a lot more useful than gold. Gold's very soft, iron's not. So, the hardship and all those kind of things increase. So there's this interesting imagery that's concocted with the image of the iron, or the metals in general. So the symbolism is pretty cool, the way he does it. But I think it just shows his ultimate pessimistic worldview, which brings me back to this idea of hope. Here is, I think, Hesiod's viewpoint. Why is hope in the jar? It's because hope is bad in that the reality that we're faced with is a reality like this. Here we are in the Iron Age. It's a world of suffering. It's a world of pain. It's a world of toil and then death. What's worse than that? I think for Hesiod, what's worse than that is having hope, which is a delusion, where you constantly think things are going to get better, when in fact they're not. So what's worse than suffering is suffering plus delusion, because it doesn't relieve your suffering in reality. You still suffer. You're just also crazy. So I think he really would place hope in this category as a negative thing. I don't know. You don't have to buy that particular interpretation, but what do you guys think of it? Yeah, that last comment, hope can cause people to lack action, maybe just sit back and not do anything. Yeah, you question if he's pretty smart. He definitely has a perspective. And when you look back at the ancients, you'd be surprised. I mean, if you ever read some of their stuff, a lot of the ancient writers are really sharp. I always think, people haven't really gotten smarter over time. I think people have gained more knowledge about things, but there have been brilliant people throughout human history. And he's not a philosopher, though he's kind of dabbling in kind of early philosophy in a sense. He's a mythologist. But he definitely has a perspective on the world that's worth considering. And okay, good. Let me give you a video clip. I do this every once in a while, but to illustrate, cool. To illustrate this idea of hope, I'm going to go back to one of my favorite series of movies, which I probably have already shown you and what we're going to deal with later this semester, which happens to be the Batman trilogy. And I'm going to give you a clip from the final movie in the series. So later on, like I said, we're going to be watching, you guys are going to watch on your own, Batman Begins. We're going to have a discussion about that as a hero myth. But how many of you have seen the final movie, which is The Dark Knight Rises? I get different feedback from students. Okay, if you have, good. A lot of people, when you ask, what your favorite film is of the series, most people I've come across have said The Dark Knight, which is the middle movie, and it's really a fantastic film. I go back and forth actually between the first and third movies as my two favorites. Not that I don't love the second one, I do, but there are certain things that are really relevant to mythology that I've noticed in the other movies. So in the movie that is the last in the series, Dark Knight Rises, there's a really important scene that has to do with the discussion on hope. It's kind of a dark scene, and I'm going to play it for you guys. Try to understand as best you can. The speaker, this is Bane. If you haven't seen the movie, because of that mask they make him wear, it's really hard to understand what he's saying at all points. But he's going to have this little discussion with Bruce Wayne about hope. So to set the stage, in the movie, Batman is defeated by Bane. He actually has his back broken, and he's put into this prison I don't think we saw that clip. I think the one I showed you last time was a Joker clip. But he's in there and he's suffering in this pit. And Bane is kind of laying out his plans for Gotham. So listen to what he says when it comes to hope.
There's a reason why this prison is the worst hell on earth. Hope. Every man who was rotted here over the centuries has looked up to the light and imagined climbing to freedom. So easy. So simple. And like shipwrecked men turning to seawater from uncontrollable thirst. Many have died trying. I learned here that there can be no true despair without hope.
Okay, I guess I stopped it there. He goes on to say he's going to, feed Gotham's citizens hope to poison their souls, right? So it's pretty clear that hope is a bad thing. And I love the line where he says there can be no true despair without hope. And I love the picture of this prison, all right? It's this pit. And we're going to see how important this imagery is later on when we do Batman, and also when we talk about hero stories, this theme of falling and rising again, major theme. But, right there, you look up, you see the sun, you see freedom, you see the light, but you're stuck in the pit. And you keep thinking about getting out and into the light, yet everybody fails. Nobody makes the climb. Okay, of course, it's not exactly accurate. As if you see the movie, you know how this works out. But he even compares it to, men stuck, shipwrecked at sea who are thirsty. And I know you might not be able to understand how he said it with his voice, but, he says you turn to seawater to try to, to deal with your thirst. But, you can't drink the seawater. I mean, you have this constant water in front of you, yet you can't ever drink it, right? So this idea of hope is a torment. It's a torture. And I think this really is very much in line with Hesiod's pessimism, okay, and how he views hope, which is kind of cool. Again, I'm the type of geek who goes to the theater, watches Dark Knight Rises, sits in the theater, and I think about Hesiod, so maybe I've got issues. But does that make sense? Let me wrap up by finishing the story of Prometheus, because it gets pretty bad for him. There's a punishment. It's not just women. Women is a torment for all of mankind for Hesiod, but Prometheus gets his own unique fate, where he is now chained up to a mountain top and tortured day after day by an eagle, sometimes a vulture, depending on the account, where it comes and eats his liver from his side. And being a Titan, he doesn't ever die. And the liver, of course, grows back, only to be eaten again the next day by the bird. So this is literally a physical, ongoing torment. Now, it's partly because of his trickery. It's partly because he dared to challenge the culture, right? Challenge the rule to the authority of Zeus. But it's partly because Prometheus has some information Zeus wants. So let me give you this idea of this prophecy that's tied up in Greek myth. There's always a great prophecy out there. Now, if you remember, I set up the story with Zeus overthrowing his own father Kronos, just like Kronos overthrew his father Uranos. Now, Zeus is afraid that he one day will be overthrown as well. And there's a prophecy that there is a particular goddess who is destined to give birth to a child more powerful than the father. Kind of vague. Most prophecies are vague. Now, the problem for Zeus is he has an insatiable sexual appetite. And he sleeps with just about everybody he comes across. Male, female, animal, doesn't really matter. He doesn't have preferences. But he really wants to know who this supposed woman is. Because if he sleeps with her, then there will be a child born that will be more powerful than him. Now, Prometheus knows who the woman is and will not tell. This is one of the reasons he's chained up. He's going to be tortured until he gives up the secret. Now, we know kind of how the story ends up, because there are hints in other myths, including some of the dramas in the 5th century, that Heracles eventually comes along and helps free Zeus, and frees Prometheus, and Prometheus's spot is taken by the famous centaur Chiron. But kind of indicates that the secret gets out, and we do find out who the woman is. And this is actually going to tie into a story we're going to read later, so I'm going to fill you in on that story again, or remind you of it, but I'll tell you who it is now, just so I don't hold you in suspense for half a semester. But the goddess is named Thetis, and Thetis is kind of a minor goddess of the seas, and she is destined to give birth to a child that's going to be more powerful than the father. But because Zeus finds out, Zeus never sleeps with Thetis. Rather, it's arranged that Thetis will end up marrying a mortal hero, a guy by the name of Peleus, who happens to be one of the Argonauts from the story of Jason and the Golden Fleece. We'll see him later. And I'll talk a little bit about their engagement and wedding, because this is all going to lead ultimately to the Trojan War. The famous child of Peleus and Thetis is a child who's going to end up being more powerful than his father, a greater hero than his father. Even though Peleus is a pretty good hero in his day, his son is... Anybody know who his son is? Probably one of the most famous heroes in all Greek mythology. And it's Achilles. Very good. Nice job. Yeah, Achilles. So you can imagine if Zeus had slept with her, Achilles would be probably the new king on the mountain. But I guess it's a happy ending for Zeus. Prometheus gets it pretty bad. Keep that image in mind, though, and including these paintings that I've supplied, kind of Renaissance era and later paintings that show Prometheus is tortured by the eagle. It's going to be very similar to the story next class, okay? So that is primarily, or actually pretty much it for the story of Prometheus. Hopefully I hit all the themes that I wanted to hit. Sometimes, I get talking, I'll go off in different directions, but hopefully you got enough out of that so that you will be confident when you get to your quiz. But does anybody have any questions before I wrap it up? Actually, I'm going to wrap up the video, and next time we're going to be doing the death of Balder. So this will be our last trickster hero. So read that if you haven't already read it. Think about, while you're reading it as best you can, the parallels between the stories of Osiris, the stories of the serpent in the garden, and even Prometheus today. So again, a lot of these things are worth noting. So next time, death of Balder. So that's it for Prometheus.